Okay, so the first metal bender that we're gonna make today is the ring bender. Now the cool thing about ring benders is they are super easy and simple to make. The first thing you need to decide is the size of ring that you want to bend. And based off that, we can choose the center pivot of our metal ring bender. When considering that size, we need to know that our center pivot needs to be about 20% smaller than the end size we want our ring to end up at. This is because when you bend material around something, when material or metal reaches its yield point, it is going to have to stretch past where it's actually going to solidify. So when you're going to bend your material around something and then you release it, it's going to have a little bit of spring back. For the first one, we're going to make a smaller ring. I chose a 1/4 inch or roughly 6.5 millimeter center shaft, and that's going to yield us a ring with about a 5/16 to 8 millimeter inside diameter. The next thing you need to consider is the gauge or the robustness of the ring that you want to make. So the gauge is how thick the wall of the ring is. Now, once you've decided the gauge or how robust you want your ring, this will allow you to choose the housing for your pivot shaft to sit into. So when we choose our housing material, we want to find a piece of material that our center shaft fits in semi-snug. It doesn't want to be sloppy, but we also want it to move pretty freely in there. Now, the gauge of wire that we're going to be able to bend is depicted by the thickness of that housing. So I have roughly a 1/8 inch or 3 mil wall on this housing here. So that's going to limit the thickness of wire that I can use for this specific one. But for a small ring like this, an 1/8 inch gauge is pretty robust. So once you have a center pivot shaft and a housing that fits over it nicely, we're going to cut our housing to 2 lengths. I'm going to do 2 separate 4-inch long lengths. Now this length doesn't matter too much, but the important part is we have 2 pieces that are about the same length. We want to clean these up so that the faces of these are pretty nice. We want to make sure we deburr them so there's nothing that's sharp that could cut us on them, and we can assemble them with our center shaft on the inside here, just like this. The next thing we need is a couple of handles to be able to twist these with. So I've just got a couple pieces of 3/8 rebar here. We're gonna cut these up and tack them on as handles. Okay, so now that we have our 2 T-handles welded up, we can take our center pivot shaft and install it in the center of them. And now we're gonna have 2 stout handles to be able to turn and manipulate that material. Now, with our center shaft, some people I've seen will tack this on the end, but I kinda like to let mine float in there, because when you start bending wire, if you wanna bend a continuous spring almost, which you can bend a spring, this allows it to float open and you can just let your rings stack on top of each other and do multiples. Next thing we need are the 2 fingers that are actually going to hold our material to bend them around. So for the little fingers to bend my material, I selected this 3/16 inch or roughly 4.5 mil, somewhere in there, shafting. Now, an important thing to know is these fingers need to be harder than the material that you're bending. Now, some shaftings are not weldable, so make sure to look into that. But you will probably not be able to use just mild steel rod for these. If you don't have access to any shafting, other ways you can do is maybe use the shank of a grade 8 bolt. That's going to be harder, going to be a little easier to get a hold of, or even cap screws. Those are going to be a little bit harder material. But in any sense, you're going to need a little bit stiffer material because it's going to need to stay in place or stay stiff while it manipulates what you're bending around it. So to place these little fingers, you're going to want to stick your pivot shaft in the center and line these up. Now, these don't have to be super particular in orientation. The only thing that is going to be critical is you want these to stick out the distance of your wall of the housing slightly past this way. So my housing wall is about 1/8 inch thick, so I'm going to make this little pin stick about 3/16 of an inch past the face of the housing. And as simple as that, we have our first metal ring bending tool. Let me show you how it works. Okay, so this tool is super fun and simple to use. It's as easy as laying your wire down into this slot here, pushing these two pieces together, and then once they're together, twisting your handles around. Once you get to this first point, you might have to lift slightly to let it jump over, like that. But then you can just keep on twisting. And you can twist your heart's content and even go as far as making a full-on torsion spring or even an extension spring. So see, there we have a stack of rings, and you can even use this as I have a piece of stainless wire here. You could use this as a torsion spring and build your own torsion spring. You could cut these down lengthwise and make a bunch of individual rings. These small benders like this are great for doing jewelry, stuff like that. You can even do larger wires like this, provided the fingers on your bender are robust enough. So as you can see, there's lots of different purposes for a ring bender. You can make like torsion springs, you can make fishing rig style elements, or you can even make small individual rings. Rings can be super useful for tie downs, to run string through, anything like that. Now, something like this is going to be too small for what you need, and you want to use a larger gauge wire. Not to worry, you can build it the same way. You're just going to scale it up. On the last one, we had a 1/4 inch shaft. This one that I made, we have a 3/4 inch shaft, and then I made provision that it can go into a vise for more leverage. This will allow you to use a much heavier gauge wire. We also have a longer handle to provide more leverage as well. And you can do it as simple as like this. You can make little hooks, turn it 90 degrees, however you want to manipulate the wire, really. Build all kinds of little doodads. Now, if the small one doesn't quite do it the job, this one's good for as small as you can go, up to probably 16 gauge wire, I would say. And then the large one, we can go from 16 up to 1/4 or 5/16 wire, I would say. But these two units pretty much limit you to wire or small round stock. What if you want to bend something like flat bar or even a small square stock? Let me show you an easy way to do that. Okay, so all we're going to need to build our flat stock bender is a couple pieces of round stock. In this case, I had a couple of grade 8 bolts in the bolt bin. And the reason I'm going to use these is the grade 8 bolts have a long shank on them. So I'm going to use the shank side, and the flange will make it easier to weld on the bottom. And the reason I grabbed the grade 8 ones is they have a higher tensile strength. So hopefully whatever I'm bending will bend before my drive rods bend. And the only other thing you're going to need is about 2 feet of rectangle stock. That could be a rectangle tube stock with about a 3mm 1/8 inch wall, or in this case, I'm going to use a 1/2 by 1.5 inch solid stock. I'm going to cut one piece down to 6 inches, one piece down to 3 inches, and then the remaining 2 feet will be the handle for the bender. Once we have our 3 parts cut out, we're going to do our whole layout. We have our 3-inch piece, our 6-inch piece, and the remainder of the material. Now, I had to go and make it a little more complicated because I had this chunk of material here, and I wanted to put a piece of round bar on there so it was a little easier on the hand. But you can just use the remainder of the material that you have. First piece can get set off to the side, and these 2 pieces have a super easy hole layout. I'm going to put a mark about 3/4 of an inch in, and then another 2 inches on center from there. So if you read it end to end, we have 3/4 of an inch, then 2.5 inches. Mark out center of these. These markings are not super critical, but we want to make it look good. On these marks, we're going to drill out our holes for our 1/2 inch rods, or 13mm, depending on what side of the pond you are from. And I believe in 2 concepts when drilling holes: lube and pilot holes. So I'm going to start out with a 1/4 inch, and then we'll step it up to a 1/2 inch. Once you get your holes drilled, we're going to take 2 of our bolts or our pieces of rod. We're going to stick 2 of them in our 6-inch chunk, and one of them in our handle. The one in the handle wants to go in the further hole back, and we want to leave the very end hole open and get those burned in. Now, an important thing to remember, these are nickel or zinc coated bolts, so you want to be cautious of that and grind that coating off. Another cool trick you can use is soak them overnight in some just regular white vinegar, super non-toxic, but it'll peel that coating off. But I just used a grinder because I was getting impatient. Now, after we've got all of our bolts welded on, I'm gonna take that final 3-inch piece and we're gonna drop it right on the end here and burn that in. And all that's gonna do is allow us to have something that we can grab in the vise to be able to secure this thing while we're using it. And there you have it, 3 super simple metal bending tools. Now, I was gonna lop the top of these threads off, but I think I'm actually gonna leave them because it could leave future opportunities for maybe sticking a washer to hold something down, or maybe incorporating other tooling into this bender. So for now, I think I'm gonna leave the threads on because I might be able to integrate other tooling by like threading different mandrels onto here. I don't know, it's a thought. Let me know if you think that could be useful down in the comments and if you would leave the threads on here for other tooling. But if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more similar content, click some of the links that are going to pop up here. If you want to be notified of upcoming videos, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's free to do so, and go build something, guys.